Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a quiet Sunday lunch. You know, the kind many of us share with family and friends. It's set against the backdrop of rural Victoria, Australia.
Mm-hmm.
Four guests arrive, a meal is served, and then within days, three of those guests are tragically dead. The fourth fighting for his life.
Just devastating. And the suspected culprit, deadly mushrooms, allegedly served in what seemed like a perfectly innocent beef Wellington.
It's a scenario that feels almost, well, unbelievable, isn't it? A really rapid descent from a moment of connection, a family meal, to just profound tragedy.
It really is. It highlights just how quickly life can change
Yeah.
and the devastating consequences that can ripple out from something as ordinary as, like you said, a shared meal.
Absolutely. And this isn't just a human tragedy. It's become this incredibly complex and highly scrutinized legal case. It's drawn attention not just across Australia, but, well, really around the globe.
Yeah, we're talking about the Leongatha mushroom poisoning case and the woman right at the center of it, Erin Patterson.
So our mission today, what we want to do, is guide you through this really complex story. We're drawing exclusively from a stack of sources you've provided us: news articles, detailed trial reporting, court notes.
Right. Think of this as us distilling those sources, trying to pull out the crucial insights, the factual nuggets, just to help you understand how this whole thing unfolded from the start.
Our journey today is really tracing the path of the investigation, literally from the moment those guests fell ill through the painstaking process of collecting evidence, physical stuff, digital stuff, and right into the courtroom where it's all being dissected right now.
Yeah, we want to help you understand the key findings that have been presented so far, the complexities, because there definitely are complexities in the evidence, and the significant legal challenges this case presents.
We're aiming to give you a clear, source-based picture of the investigation's trajectory, helping you grasp the pivotal moments and the details as they've emerged in the proceedings.
So far, at least, the trial is still ongoing.
Exactly. All right, so let's start at the very beginning. The lunch itself and those first terrifying hours and days.
Okay, so the scene is set in Leongatha. It's a town nestled about 135 kilometers southeast of Melbourne, down in Victoria. And it's Sunday, July 29, 2023. Erin Patterson hosted a lunch at her home there.
And the guests, they were her former in-laws, Don Patterson and Gail Patterson, both aged 70.
Right. And joining them were Gail's sister, Heather Wilkinson, who was 66, and Heather's husband, Ian Wilkinson, aged 68.
It's important to note, too, Erin Patterson herself also ate some of the meal.
Yeah, that's the key point. And her estranged husband, Simon Patterson, he was actually invited too, but apparently he declined the invitation the night before. That detail becomes quite relevant later on.
And the meal. The meal at the heart of this tragedy was described as a special meal. It was a beef Wellington, and it contained mushrooms.
A dish that sounds so comforting, familiar. But in this case, turned deadly.
There was a specific detail that came out during testimony, wasn't there? Something about the plates.
Yeah, that's right. It was recalled by Heather Wilkinson, and Simon Patterson also corroborated it. Apparently, Erin ate from a different colored plate, described as sort of orangey tan,
Okay.
compared to the four guests who all ate from gray plates. Simon Patterson mentioned Erin owned mismatched plate sets, and he specifically recalled a colorful plastic plate their daughter had made. He thought maybe that was the one Erin used.
Huh. So that discrepancy in plating, I mean, if true, that could potentially be significant, couldn't it? Depending on what was served on which plate.
It could be, yeah. It's one of those details the investigation would certainly look at.
Now, adding another layer of complexity, right from the start, the sources reveal that Erin Patterson admitted she lied to her guests about why she was having the lunch.
Right. She initially told them she had a suspected cancer diagnosis. That was the pretext she gave for the lunch. To discuss health issues, thank them for their support, maybe bolster her relationship with Simon's family. She apparently felt they were becoming a bit distant.
But her later explanation for that specific lie, the one she gave in court during her testimony, that was different, wasn't it?
Yeah, she said she was actually embarrassed about her body, her eating habits, and plans she had for gastric bypass surgery. She apparently had a pre-surgery appointment scheduled for September. So it wasn't about a diagnosed illness, but more about sort of body image issues and this upcoming surgery.
Okay, so that's the setup. Then the reaction to the meal, it was swift and severe.
Extremely swift. By the very next day, July 30th, all four guests started experiencing these debilitating symptoms. They were admitted to hospital, initially with suspected gastroenteritis.
Dawn and Gail Patterson, they were taken to Dandenong Hospital first, then transferred to the specialist liver unit at Austin Hospital in Melbourne.
And Heather and Ian Wilkinson, they initially went to Corroborra, then Leongatha Hospital, and they were also later transferred to Austin Hospital too.
What about Erin Patterson? Does she report feeling unwell?
Yes, the sources say she did report feeling unwell around this time. Stomach pains and diarrhea on July 30th and again on July 31st. She actually visited Leongatha Hospital herself on July 31st. But, according to testimony, she reportedly refused to be admitted, repeatedly, despite reporting symptoms.
And this is where her interaction with the medical staff gets, well, pretty scrutinized, right?
Very much so. A nurse, Cindy Monroe, testified that she assessed Erin at the hospital, and her observation was that Erin didn't look unwell like Heather and Ian. That's a direct comparison from a medical professional who saw them all. It's a key detail.
And the doctors were concerned.
Extremely concerned. Dr. Chris Webster testified that he was so worried about Erin's welfare during that visit on July 31st that he actually called the police.
Wow. Before anyone had even passed away.
Yes. He described warning Erin directly, face to face, about the possibility of deadly death cap mushroom poisoning.
Yeah.
A really stark warning.
And despite that, she
reportedly discharged herself against medical advice within just 5 minutes of arriving. Dr. Webster's call to 000, where he expressed his concerns. That was later played to the jury during the trial.
Now, her defense team brought up something about this, didn't they? About discharging herself before.
They did. They highlighted in court that this wasn't the first time she discharged herself against medical advice. It apparently also happened back in 2015, after what she described as the traumatic birth of her son. A very difficult experience where she felt this strong need to go home to her baby.
So they presented that as context for her behavior in 2023.
Exactly. Arguing that maybe she felt she couldn't just check into the hospital after the lunch, citing, needing to care for her children and animals at home, trying to frame it as a pattern of behavior under stress, perhaps.
Okay, what about Erin's own account of how she felt after the lunch?
Well, her account included having diarrhea for several days and taking medications for her symptoms. Her daughter also testified, saying Erin used the bathroom maybe 10 times the day after the lunch.
But she was still functioning.
Apparently so. Even while reportedly feeling unwell, Erin stated she drove her son to Tayab for a flying lesson.
Right, and then there's the detail about the leftovers. That's generated a lot of discussion.
Yes, it has. The sources indicate that Erin's children consumed leftovers from the lunch for dinner later on.
And the crucial point.
Crucially, there were no reported adverse reactions from the children documented in the provided source material we have. They seem to be fine.
Which raises all sorts of questions.
It certainly does. And one final point from those initial days. Simon Patterson testified that during a conversation at the hospital, just a day after the lunch, he first heard about Erin using a food dehydrator.
Ah, the dehydrator. That becomes important later.
Very important. It was just a mention then, but it foreshadowed a key piece of evidence police would later search for.
So just to recap that initial phase, within a couple of days, this family lunch escalates from a severe medical emergency to a situation so concerning that doctors are calling the police.
Yeah. Erin's behavior at the hospital, especially leaving after being warned about deadly mushrooms, that became a huge point of scrutiny. Even though she reported having some symptoms herself, they were apparently quite different from her guests.
This phase really marks the point where, as you said, this private tragedy spills over into the public domain and becomes a formal investigation. The doctor's concerns, the potential link to poisonous mushrooms.
And Erin's actions, her differing symptoms compared to her guests, those immediately raised red flags. That's what prompted law enforcement involvement even before the full, awful scale of the disaster was clear.
It's an incredible escalation. It shows how medical observations and professional concerns can literally trigger a criminal investigation. Her reported lack of severe symptoms, the ones consistent with deadly death cap poisoning, coupled with discharging herself, it presented a stark contrast.
A very stark contrast to the rapidly deteriorating condition of her guests.
And while her defense offered context for her hospital discharge referencing that previous instance, the circumstances are pretty different, aren't they? Recovering from childbirth versus being explicitly warned about deadly poison after hosting a meal that's incapacitated 4 people.
They are clearly distinct situations, yeah. And that highlights the challenge for the court, for the jury, in interpreting actions and motivations, especially when someone is under stress.
And the fact that children ate leftovers without apparent ill effects. That's a massive question mark, isn't it? Does it mean some portions weren't contaminated, or maybe her portion, the one the kids might have eaten from, was different?
Exactly. The sources don't specify which leftovers were eaten, just that they were from the lunch. So that ambiguity leaves room for different interpretations. Did all plates have the same thing?
Yeah.
Was the toxin evenly distributed? We don't know for sure from the sources.
Right. And Simon's early mention of the food dehydrator, that just hangs there, foreshadowing what's to come.
Precisely. Which brings us to the next phase, the truly devastating phase. The deaths of the guests and the formal launch of the homicide investigation.
Yes, tragically, despite all the medical intervention, the initial severe symptoms proved fatal for 3 of the guests. Heather Wilkinson and Gail Patterson both passed away on August 4th, 2023. That's just 6 days after the lunch.
And the very next day, August 5th, Don Patterson also died. Ian Wilkinson, thankfully, is the sole survivor, but he had a really long road to recovery. He was in hospital for weeks, finally being released on September 23rd, 2023.
So, with 3 lives lost and a 4th person critically ill, that's when Victoria Police formally initiated a homicide investigation.
Yeah, the focus shifted dramatically. It went from trying to identify the source of the illness to determining responsibility for the deaths.
And a critical early step in any modern investigation like this is gathering electronic evidence. The source's state police seized Aaron Patterson's electronic devices on August 5th. That's the same day Don Patterson died, the same day the homicide investigation was formally launched.
And this is where things get, well, particularly complex, and maybe problematic for investigators. The sources note that Erin factory reset her phone the very same day police seized the devices, August 5th.
The same day.
The same day. And then she apparently did it again on August 6th.
Wow. And wasn't there something about one of those resets happening after the police physically had the phone?
That's the really remarkable claim, yes. That one reset allegedly occurred remotely after police had taken physical possession of the phone.
How could that even happen?
Well, it raises serious questions, doesn't it? Questions about the secure handling of evidence by the police. The sources mentioned the standard procedure is supposed to prevent remote wipes once a device is seized, so it implies a potential procedural issue there.
And of course, it raises massive questions about Aaron Patterson's potential intent.
Well,
Why reset a phone, especially potentially remotely, right after police take it in a homicide investigation?
exactly. It looks highly suspicious, regardless of the technicalities of how it might have happened.
And this digital activity, it ties directly into her initial interactions with the police about other potential evidence, doesn't it? Like the dehydrator.
Yes. The sources detail that in a police video interview conducted on that same crucial day, August 5th, Erin Patterson initially denied ever having dehydrated food, and she flatly denied even owning a dehydrator.
But she later admitted those were lies.
She did. When she took the stand in court much later, she admitted those initial denials were lies. She described them as a stupid knee-jerk reaction, saying it stemmed from panic as the tragedy unfolded and police started questioning her.
And that food dehydrator, the one Simon Patterson had mentioned hearing about at the hospital, police obviously wanted to find it.
Absolutely, it became a key item. The sources state that Erin disposed of the dehydrator in a skip bin, like a dumpster, at a transfer station in a place called Kunwara. This happened around August 2023.
After the deaths, after the police interview where she denied having one.
Correct. Her explanation for doing this, given during her testimony, was that she became increasingly anxious. She said people, specifically mentioning Simon confronting her about the dehydrator and the poisoning while he was still in the hospital, began accusing her of intentional poisoning. She stated this anxiety and fear contributed to her decision to get rid of it.
But the timing, disposing of it, after people started asking questions, after police had seized other devices, that looks like trying to hide something, doesn't it?
Well, that's certainly how the prosecution would frame it.
Yeah.
It's a critical piece of circumstantial evidence suggesting consciousness of guilt, or at least an attempt to conceal evidence, rather than just pure panic. It presents a huge challenge for the defense to explain away.
The sources also mentioned a police video interview from August 5th, about 21 minutes long, that was played to the court. What does she say in that?
In that early interview, she's reported to have stated she had been very, very helpful with the health department, and that she wanted to help the investigation as much as possible.
Okay.
She also apparently expressed a strong desire to maintain those relationships with Simon's family, her in-laws, saying they'd always been really good to her, even after her separation from Simon.
Which contrasts with other messages that came out later.
Yes, reportedly. That expressed sentiment contrasts with other private messages shown later in court, where she was apparently quite critical of the family. That highlights a potential discrepancy between her public statements and her private feelings or frustrations.
So this second phase, triggered by the deaths, it marks the real start of the criminal investigation. Key early actions, seizing devices, which then revealed these concerning factory resets. Her initial lies about the dehydrator, then disposing of it.
Right. These became significant points of focus, points she later tried to explain as panic-driven, but which immediately raised questions about her truthfulness and intentions from the investigator's perspective.
It really lays the groundwork for the whole evidence trail police would follow.
Exactly. It sets the stage for the detailed forensic and digital analysis that was to come.
It just shows how quickly the focus shifts, doesn't it? From initial reports to securing evidence, analyzing it, and how a suspect's early statements and actions can become absolutely central to the case.
And that contrast between her expressed desire to maintain good relationships and the reported content of some private messages, it just adds another layer of complexity, another thing for the jury to weigh up when considering her character and relationships.
Which brings us right into the nitty-gritty, the deep dive into the evidence itself, the digital footprints, the fungi, the forensics that investigators meticulously collected and analyzed.
Yeah, this is where a lot of the technical detail comes in. Detective leading senior constable Stephen Eckmestall, who was the informant in the case, played a central role here. He presented a significant amount of the digital evidence gathered.
So what kind of digital evidence are we talking about?
Well, the police investigation looked into a range of electronic devices and SIM cards linked to Aaron Patterson, different phones, Samsung, Nokia, OPPO handsets. The sources even mentioned a detailed flowchart used in court to visually track how SIM cards moved between different phones over several years, going way back to 2019.
Why is that important?
It helps establish which specific device she was likely using at any given critical time, linking the person to the device, to the location or activity.
Right. And location data was key too.
Yes, they used call charge records, or CCRs, and also electronic-based monitoring data, EBM. Basically, CCRs log when your phone connects to a tower for a call or text, giving a general location. EBM data can potentially be more granular, using signals from multiple towers to get a possibly tighter fix on a device's location.
And what did this data suggest?
That data presented in court was used to suggest that Aaron's phone was recorded near known death cap mushroom spots around the time, relevant to sourcing the mushrooms for the lunch.
Okay, but this location data wasn't straightforward. There was some debate.
Yeah, there was significant debate during the trial. It highlights some of the practical limitations investigators can face. The defense team, during cross-examination, really questioned Detective Eppingstall about the extent of the EBM data analysis performed.
They brought in an expert.
Well, they referenced Professor Matthew Sorrell, a senior lecturer who specializes in telecommunications and digital forensics. The defense reportedly argued that potentially more detailed EBM data, or maybe more advanced analysis techniques like line-of-sight analysis,
Which is?
a more complex way to try and pinpoint location. But Detective Eppingstall apparently stated that particular science hadn't really been proven for use in Australian courts yet. The defense argued these could have been used to get a more precise location fix.
And what was the detective's response?
He reportedly acknowledged that, yes, EBM data could be more useful than CCRs, sometimes for pinpointing location. But he also explained the real-world constraints. He was quoted saying something like, "I want everything, I'm greedy, but I don't get everything all the time."
Meaning budget constraints.
Exactly. He explained that getting more extensive analysis or bringing in expensive external experts like Professor Sorrell needed approval from his commanders. There were specific instructions to manage costs and also ensure the evidence presented in court was robust, using methods accepted by the courts, not potentially unproven techniques.
So it's a practical reality of investigations. They can't always chase down every single possible avenue.
Precisely, even in high-profile cases. It leaves a question for the jury, doesn't it? Was the location data presented sufficient, or could more, or should more, have been done?
Fascinating. Now, what about this iNaturalist app? That seemed like a really compelling piece of digital evidence.
It did seem very significant, yes. For listeners who don't know, iNaturalist is this global citizen science platform. People record and share observations of nature, plants, animals, fungi, often with photos tagged with the location.
And what did the evidence show regarding Aaron Patterson?
Evidence showed she used a specific search engine and visited the iNaturalist website. And critically, this included visiting pages that displayed the locations of 2 reported death cap mushroom sightings near her home. This was back in May 2022.
So over a year before the fatal lunch.
Yes. One of those sightings was actually posted by well-known mycologist Dr. Tom May, who later testified, and the other by just a regular citizen scientist.
That sounds pretty damning, suggesting prior knowledge or at least interest in where these deadly mushrooms grew near her house.
It certainly appears significant. Yet, when Erin Patterson testified, she repeatedly said she couldn't clearly recall using the iNaturalist site for this specific purpose.
She didn't remember looking up death cap locations near her home.
Apparently not clearly. When the prosecution asked her directly if she had an interest in death caps, her response was cautious. Something like, "It depends what you mean by an interest."
So that contrasts the digital evidence versus her lack of clear recollection. That became a major point of challenge to her testimony, right?
Absolutely. The prosecution would argue it suggests she wasn't being entirely truthful or was deliberately trying to distance herself from that activity.
And this evidence also created a challenge for the court itself.
Yeah, a modern challenge.
Mhm.
The judge reportedly had to explicitly warn the jury not to Google or search for the iNaturalist URL that was provided to them on their court iPads.
Because jurors aren't allowed to do their own research?
Exactly. It's a standard instruction, but it shows how managing internet-based evidence in a courtroom requires really careful control in the digital age. Jurors must rely only on the evidence presented in court.
Okay, let's shift back to the mushrooms themselves, their origin. Erin Patterson's story about this changed, didn't it?
It seems so, yes.
Hmm.
The sources detail her evolving accounts, particularly in conversations with a health official named Sally Ann Atkinson. Initially, she apparently mentioned the mushrooms were store-bought,
Okay.
but later she suggested it might have been a mix, including some from a grocer down in Melbourne.
And then she raised another possibility.
Yes. At one point, she raised the possibility that foraged mushrooms might have accidentally gotten mixed in. She was quoted asking something like, "What if they'd gone in the container with the Chinese mushrooms? Maybe that had happened."
Which implies accidental contamination rather than deliberate inclusion.
Precisely. An accidental mix-up.
This brings us to the expert testimony from Dr. Tom May, the mycologist, the same guy whose iNaturalist sighting was apparently viewed.
That's him. He provided crucial expert testimony about death cap mushrooms. He explained their characteristics, stressed their extreme toxicity because of the amatoxins they contain,
And how easy they are to mistake for edible ones.
especially once they're prepared. He emphasized that once they're chopped, cooked, or significantly dehydrated, the key distinguishing features like cap shape, color, the base of the stalk are altered or lost. Distinguishing them from safe mushrooms then becomes incredibly difficult, if not impossible, without real expert knowledge.
And critically, he said they aren't sold commercially.
Correct. Dr. May stressed that death cap mushrooms are not commercially available for purchase anywhere. This means any death caps found in that beef Wellington would have to have been foraged from the wild.
Which directly challenges any story suggesting only store-bought mushrooms were used.
Directly. It points strongly towards foraging being involved if death caps were indeed present.
Okay. And back to the dehydrator, the one she initially denied owning, then admitted getting rid of. Was there forensic evidence linked to that?
Yes. An agreed facts statement, meaning both prosecution and defense accepted it, was presented in court. It confirmed that analysis of fingerprints found on the food dehydrator matched Erin Patterson's fingerprints.
So definitely proving she handled it.
It places her in direct physical contact with the device, yes.
Beyond these key pieces, the digital data, the mushroom accounts, the dehydrator, what other evidence did the investigation gather?
The investigation pulled together a lot of other information presented in court. Things like Woolworth's transaction history, presumably looking for mushroom purchases or lack thereof, medical records for various people involved, Erin's personal diary,
Text messages.
text messages, yes, Facebook messages too, her phone call history, even screenshots of web pages she might have visited. The sources also mentioned some messages that reportedly contradicted information in her Medicare records about health appointments, raising further questions about consistency.
Wow. This phase of evidence analysis really shows the sheer depth and breadth of a modern criminal investigation, doesn't it?
It really does. They weave together everything, physical objects like the dehydrator, vast amounts of digital data like phone movements, website visits, messages, transaction records, trying to construct a picture of someone's actions, their knowledge, their potential intentions leading up to a critical event.
And it highlights the challenges, too. Presenting complex digital evidence clearly in court, debating how conclusive location data really is, needing expert testimony to explain technical things like fungus identification.
Absolutely. And interpreting toxicity. These are all critical aspects of the process.
It's fascinating how seemingly small everyday actions, visiting a website, using your phone, owning a kitchen appliance, can leave these traces that become potentially significant pieces of circumstantial evidence when you put them together with the other facts of the case.
And Aaron's varying accounts about where the mushrooms came from, especially when combined with the mycologist saying death caps must be foraged. Well, that goes right to the core question, doesn't it? Was this an unthinkable, tragic accident due to a mistake mixing mushrooms in the pantry, or was it something more deliberate?
Which leads us directly to the medical evidence and the autopsy findings, the stark scientific confirmation of the poison's devastating effect.
Yes. Dr. Brian Beer, a forensic pathologist, read from reports compiled by his colleague, Dr. Michael Duffy. He detailed the postmortem examinations carried out on the victims.
And the findings.
The autopsies confirmed the severe impact of the poisoning. They cited extensive liver necrosis, which basically means widespread death of liver tissue and subsequent multi-organ failure, as the confirmed cause of death for Heather Wilkinson, Gail Patterson, and Don Patterson.
A clear diagnosis pointing to a potent liver toxin, completely consistent with amatoxin poisoning from death cap mushrooms.
Exactly. And the sources specifically note the finding of alpha-amanitin and beta-amanitin. These are the main and most deadly amatoxins found in death caps in Don Patterson.
Just in Don Patterson.
The source material mentions the findings for Don Patterson were unlike the other two. Now, that could mean several things, maybe variations in the specific toxins detected, or different concentration levels, or perhaps even differences in the testing methods used for each victim. We don't know the exact reason for that phrasing from the sources provided.
But the key point is,
The key point is the presence of these specific deadly compounds, these amatoxins, in at least one victim directly links the deaths to the known poisons found in death caps.
and crucially, the severity of the victim's condition, the autopsy findings. How did that compare to Aaron Patterson's reported symptoms and medical state?
That's a critical contrast. While she did report experiencing those gastrointestinal symptoms, stomach pain, diarrhea in the days after the lunch, medical testimony indicated that doctors concluded her liver enzymes were not significantly elevated in the same way as the victims.
So her condition wasn't consistent with severe death cap poisoning.
Not with the severe life-threatening poisoning suffered by her guests, according to the medical testimony reported in the sources.
This difference in medical outcome between the guests and Aaron Patterson, that's huge for the prosecution, isn't it?
It's a critical piece of evidence for them, yes. It immediately raises questions. Did she ingest the same quantity of toxin as her guests? Was her portion of the meal maybe less contaminated, or perhaps contained no toxin at all? Why the difference?
But the defense tried to provide some context for her medical situation and history.
They did. They introduced elements of Aaron's medical history. They presented medical records from 2021 to 2023, showing she had expressed concerns about potentially having ovarian cancer and had sought medical treatment for various things, even though no cancer diagnosis was ever established.
What was the purpose of bringing that up?
Well, the apparent purpose was likely to lend some credibility to her explanation for lying about having cancer as the reason for the lunch. To suggest the lie wasn't completely out of the blue, but perhaps rooted in some pre-existing, even if maybe mismanaged, health anxiety she genuinely experienced.
And there were messages about other health concerns, too.
Yes, her signal messages from January 2022, where she apparently discussed experiencing symptoms she thought might be heart problems. She wrote something like, "Feels like my heart is working overtime." Those were also reportedly presented. It adds to the picture of her expressing health concerns before the lunch incident.
So the medical evidence is stark. It confirms the devastating impact of the poison on the three victims, leading directly to their deaths.
But it also highlights that significant discrepancy in Aaron Patterson's medical state compared to her guests. That's a central point of contention. The prosecution likely uses it to suggest she didn't eat the same poisoned food, while the defense tries to address it or explain it away, perhaps linking her symptoms to other things or suggesting lower exposure.
The presence of the specific amatoxins in the victims provides that irrefutable link to the poison's role.
While the contrasting medical outcomes between Aaron and her guests just raise these profound questions about what exactly she ate, what she knew, and her actions around the meal.
And the defense strategy of bringing in her prior health anxieties, her history of discharging herself against medical advice, that's clearly an attempt to frame her behavior, maybe some inconsistencies, in a way that suggests distress or personal issues rather than calculation or malicious intent.
Exactly. Trying to paint a picture of someone perhaps overwhelmed, prone to anxiety, maybe making poor decisions under pressure rather than a calculating poisoner.
Which brings us to a really pivotal moment in the trial. Erin Patterson's decision to actually take the stand in her own defense.
Yes, that was a significant move. Erin Patterson chose to testify, starting her evidence in the 6th week of the trial, which is around June 2, 2025. It's always a big decision for an accused person. It allows them to directly address the court, offer their perspective.
But it also opens them up to intense cross-examination.
Absolutely. Rigorous cross-examination from the prosecution.
So on the stand, she had the chance to give her side of the story, explain the evidence against her.
Yes. She spoke about her relationship with Simon Patterson. She described their marriage as having been, tumultuous, marked by separations between 2009 and 2015, which she blamed on communication difficulties. But she stated that by 2023, things had improved between them.
And her relationship with her former in-laws, Dawn and Gail.
She spoke about them in very emotional terms, reportedly. She described Gail as an invaluable mother-in-law, saying Gail provided crucial support after the difficult birth of her first baby, teaching her how to relax and enjoy motherhood.
She saw them as parental figures.
She stated that after her own parents passed away, she had come to view Dawn and Gail as her parents, and she said she genuinely wanted to maintain close relationships with them.
But Simon Patterson's testimony added some other layers to the family dynamics, particularly around money.
It did. He presented information about Erin inheriting quite a substantial amount, $2 million, back in 2006, investing it, and apparently loaning about $1 million of that to his siblings.
And there was friction.
He mentioned friction over property and also tax arrangements, specifically noting that Erin was reportedly upset that he had listed himself as separated in his 2022 tax returns, as this would apparently affect their financial situation somehow.
And those private messages again, showing resentment.
Reportedly, yes. While Erin apparently denied describing Simon as a bad father in messages, other messages presented in court reportedly revealed alleged resentment, describing him using terms like deadbeat and expressing anger at his family for, in her view, not supporting her in previous disputes.
So it paints a complex picture of family tensions, financial issues.
Yeah. And while the prosecution doesn't legally need to prove a motive for murder, this context certainly adds layers to the narrative being presented to the jury.
Okay, so how did she explain the key points against her when she testified? The cancer lie.
She reiterated her previous account for that, saying it was due to embarrassment about her weight, her eating habits, and that planned gastric bypass surgery she had scheduled for September 2023.
And the mushrooms. How does she say they got into the meal?
Her explanation from the stand was that foraged mushrooms ended up in the beef Wellington because of a mistake about the contents of her containers in the pantry.
So an accidental mixing, not intentional foraging for poison.
That was her claim, yes. An accidental mix-up in the pantry.
What about lying about the dehydrator and then getting rid of it?
She testified again that her initial lies to police, saying she'd never dehydrated food, didn't own a dehydrator, were that stupid knee-jerk reaction born out of panic.
And disposing of it.
She directly linked getting rid of it to becoming anxious after people, and she specifically mentioned Simon confronting her about the dehydrator and poisoning while he was in the hospital, began accusing her of intentional poisoning. She stated this anxiety and fear prompted her to dispose of the item.
Okay, and her own symptoms. How did she account for those, given they weren't as severe?
She claimed she only ate a small portion of the beef Wellington itself. She testified that she later threw up, but attributed that to binge eating 2/3 of a cake, suggesting maybe that contributed to her gastrointestinal issues.
But she did admit to symptoms.
Yes. She admitted she had diarrhea for several days and took medication to manage those symptoms.
And her defense team brought up the hospital discharge again during her testimony.
They did. They used her testimony to highlight that past history of discharging herself against medical advice back in 2015 after the childbirth trauma, presenting it again as context for her 2023 discharge from Leongatha Hospital, arguing she felt she couldn't just check in, needed to be home for her kids and animals.
So that was her side. How did the prosecution challenge it?
Well, as expected, they conducted a rigorous cross-examination. They reportedly suggested her actions, like getting rid of the dehydrator, not immediately telling medical staff about the possibility of foraged mushrooms being involved, weren't panic at all, but rather calculated steps taken to avoid detection.
They challenged her characterization of relationships, too.
Yes, they reportedly challenged her denial of having two faces, presenting this public image of good relations with the in-laws while privately expressing criticism in messages.
And did they suggest a reason why she might have poisoned them?
They reportedly put to her the suggestion that she had prepared a spare poisoned meal specifically intended for Simon Patterson, just in case he had attended the lunch. It was a suggestion she reportedly rejected.
And what about the eye naturalist evidence, her memory of that?
That remained a point of contention. She reportedly struggled under cross-examination to recall that key online activity visiting the pages showing death cap sightings near her home. She maintained she couldn't clearly recall using the site for that specific purpose, despite the digital evidence presented earlier.
So her testimony was really the defense's main chance to offer alternative explanations for all this damaging evidence.
Absolutely, for the inconsistencies, the lies, the suspicious actions. But the prosecution's cross-examination aimed squarely at undermining her credibility, arguing her explanations were implausible or maybe masked a deliberate, calculated intention.
It presents such a profound challenge for the jury, doesn't it? Weighing her explanations against all that circumstantial evidence, assessing her credibility, especially after she admitted lying about the cancer and the dehydrator initially.
Exactly. And trying to determine whether her account, accidental mixing, panic, specific health reasons, aligns with the totality of the evidence presented by the prosecution.
Her admission of prior lies, even if explained as panic, must inevitably color how a jury views the rest of her testimony.
It's bound to. And those complex family dynamics, the financial issues that emerged, they just add more layers that the prosecution and defense would interpret very differently when arguing about motive, context, or state of mind.
Which brings us to the broader context surrounding this case, its huge impact in the public eye, and the legal considerations that frame the trial itself.
Yeah, this case has undeniably sparked a massive media frenzy. It's attracted significant attention, not just domestically in Australia, but internationally too. Big names like the Washington Post, BBC News, CNN, they've all covered it extensively.
It really captured global attention.
It did. The nature of it is just so gripping and tragic. Victoria Police Inspector Dean Thomas even noted way back in October 2023 that the investigation was subjected to incredibly intense levels of public scrutiny and curiosity from media outlets all over the world.
And that interest translated to the courtroom.
Very much so. The level of interest has been so high that a large media contingent has regularly attended the trial proceedings down at the Morwell courthouse. Apparently, it led to limited space in the actual courtroom, requiring overflow rooms just for reporters.
And all of this media coverage, amplified by social media, it fuels public discussion, doesn't it?
Naturally, it's led to extensive online discussions, loads of public speculation about Aaron Patterson's guilt or innocence, people debating the strength of the evidence, possible motivations.
Even concerns about jury selection.
Yeah, discussions about the challenges authorities might face in selecting an impartial jury in such a high-profile case, given just how much media exposure there's been. Can you find jurors who haven't already formed an opinion?
And reflecting this intense public interest, several true crime podcasts have popped up specifically covering this case.
Yes, with titles like Mushroom Case Daily, The Mushroom Cook, Say Grace.
Yeah.
It shows the demand for ongoing information.
And how are these podcasts approaching it? Are they like some others that have maybe influenced trials?
Well, one source we looked at noted that these particular podcasts seem to be largely aiming for what they describe as objective reporting, trying to build listener understanding of the legal proceedings as they happen, rather than actively investigating or trying to sway opinion.
So trying to avoid that jurification effect.
That seemed to be the observation, yes. Contrasting them with some other podcasts, like The Teacher's Pet, which were seen by some as potentially influencing public opinion or interfering with the trial process through their own investigative journalism.
So it seems there's an awareness, at least among some outlets, of the need to report carefully on an ongoing trial.
It appears so. A recognition of that delicate balance between informing the highly engaged public and respecting the integrity of the legal process, not wanting to prejudice the outcome.
Okay, so legally speaking, where does the case stand? Remind us of the charges.
Right. Aaron Patterson was charged with 3 counts of murder for Dawn Patterson, Gail Patterson, and Heather Wilkinson, and 1 count of attempted murder concerning the survivor, Ian Wilkinson.
And her plea.
She entered pleas of not guilty to all those charges. And notably, she chose to fast-track her case directly to the Supreme Court of Victoria. This bypasses the usual committal proceedings in the lower magistrate's court.
And earlier charges were dropped.
Yes, earlier charges alleging attempted murder against her estranged husband, Simon Patterson, on 3 separate occasions prior to the lunch, those were dropped by the prosecution.
And the trial is still going.
Yes, as of early June 2025, when our sources were current, the trial was actively ongoing. It had already lasted for 6 weeks, and it was expected to continue for some time yet.
Now, the fundamental legal principle here, the burden of proof.
Crucial. It rests entirely on the prosecution. They have to prove Aaron Patterson's guilt beyond reasonable doubt,
Which is a very high standard.
the highest standard in criminal law. It means the jury must be virtually certain of her guilt based solely on the evidence presented in court, leaving no other rational explanation possible.
And looking at the discussions among observers, legal commentators reflected in the sources, is there agreement on whether the evidence meets that standard?
Not really. There's ongoing debate. It centers on whether the circumstantial evidence presented so far is sufficient to meet that very high standard, especially for the charges of murder and attempted murder, which require proving intent to kill or cause really serious harm.
Some think the evidence points clearly to intent.
Yes, some argue that the evidence, things like the digital trails, the alleged lies, the disposal of the dehydrator, the differing symptoms, points clearly towards an intentional act.
But others aren't so sure.
Others feel there isn't that definitive smoking gun. No direct evidence like a confession or clear proof of planning that proves intent beyond reasonable doubt. Especially, they argue, concerning the inclusion of poisonous mushrooms when Heather and Ina Wilkinson, Gil's sister and brother-in-law, were also guests. What was the motive there?
So they suggest maybe recklessness,
Nailed it.
slaughter.
Some observers suggest that based on the evidence presented so far, a conclusion of recklessness leading to death manslaughter might be more readily supported by the evidence than intentional murder. Proving she meant for them to die is the hurdle for the murder charge.
It really highlights the core legal challenge here, doesn't it? Proving intentionality when the evidence is largely circumstantial.
Exactly. The jury has to infer intent from her actions, her statements, the surrounding circumstances, rather than having explicit proof of her state of mind.
And the potential outcomes are stark.
Very stark. If found guilty of murder, Aaron Patterson faces a maximum penalty of life imprisonment in Victoria. If found not guilty, she'll be acquitted of the charges and released.
And it all hinges on the jury's decision.
Entirely. After hearing all the evidence, considering all the arguments from both sides, the jury has to decide if they are satisfied, beyond reasonable doubt, that the prosecution has proven she intentionally caused those deaths and the harm to Ian Wilkinson. They have to navigate this incredibly complex web of circumstantial evidence, conflicting testimony, forensic findings, and the very different interpretations offered by the prosecution and the defense.
The intense public and media interest just underscores the profound human tragedy at the heart of all this.
It really does. While the ongoing legal process meticulously tries to navigate the complexities of proving intent and assigning criminal responsibility in a situation with just devastating consequences for so many people.
And the role of new media, like those specialized podcasts covering the trial, it's an interesting modern development, isn't it? Trying to keep the public informed while hopefully respecting the integrity of the judicial process.
It is. It shows how these cases are followed and analyzed very closely now from so many different angles.
Definitely a case that has gripped many people. So, as we bring this deep dive to a close, let's just briefly recap the journey of this investigation as we've traced it through the source material we had. From that ordinary, yet ultimately tragic, family lunch, right through to the intricate evidence being debated in court.
We started with the immediate aftermath, didn't we? That meal on July 29th, the rapid hospitalization of the 4 guests, and then Aaron Patterson's own reported symptoms, which were different, and her controversial visit to Leongatha Hospital on July 31st, where she was explicitly warned about deadly mushrooms, but still chose to discharge herself against medical advice.
Then we saw how the investigation just dramatically escalated following the tragic deaths of 3 guests in early August. That triggered the formal homicide inquiry, the seizure of Aaron Patterson's electronic devices.
And the discovery of that concerning activity, like the factory resets, plus her initial lies to police about owning a food dehydrator, which she later admitted and tried to explain as a panic reaction that also led to her disposing of it.
The analysis of evidence then revealed those crucial digital footprints. The location data placing her phone near known death cap mushroom sightings, and that controversial activity on the iNaturalist app. The prosecution used that to suggest prior knowledge or interest in toxic fungi.
Which contrasted sharply with Aaron's testimony, where she said she couldn't clearly recall that specific activity.
We also touched on the mycologist's expert testimony explaining death caps, how they must be foraged. Erin's own varying accounts of where the mushrooms came from given to health officials, and the confirmation of her fingerprints on that disposed dehydrator.
Alongside all the other digital trails messages, transaction histories that painted a really complex picture of her relationships, communications, and actions leading up to the lunch.
The medical evidence was stark, too, confirming the severe and fatal poisoning of the victims due to those amatoxins, but crucially highlighting Erin's significantly different medical state. That became a key point in questioning her level of exposure to the toxin.
And finally, we covered Erin Patterson taking a stand herself, offering her explanations for all those contentious issues. The cancer lie, embarrassment, surgery plans, how the mushrooms got in the meal, pantry mistake, why she lied about and disposed of the dehydrator, panic after accusations, her account of her own symptoms, small portion, threw up cake, and the context for her hospital discharge, past trauma, needed to care for kids.
All of which, of course, were subject to rigorous challenge and very different interpretations by the prosecution during cross-examination.
What this deep dive really reveals, I think, is just the intricate, painstaking process by which complex investigations like this unfold. They involve piecing together such diverse forms of evidence, medical reports, forensic digital trails, witness statements, the defendant's own words trying to build a coherent narrative that explains events and actions.
It powerfully illustrates that fundamental challenge of proving intent, doesn't it? Especially in cases built mainly on circumstantial evidence. Actions, statements, even admitted lies or inconsistencies, they can all be open to multiple interpretations. Panic versus calculation, accident versus deliberation.
And it really underscores how technology is now just inextricably linked with the legal system. It provides incredibly powerful investigative tools, but it also presents new challenges. How do you handle digital evidence securely? How do you analyze it effectively? How do you present it persuasively in court? All while grappling with constraints like budgets and the slow pace at which new forensic science gets accepted.
Ultimately, though, beneath all the legal complexity, the media frenzy, the intense public interest, this case remains a profound human tragedy. Lives lost, a family utterly devastated, a community shaken to its core.
Yeah, it becomes this very public legal battle where the immense task before the court, before the jury, is to try and discern the truth amidst these conflicting accounts, these tragic outcomes, and all the intricate details brought out by the investigation.
It really raises a fascinating question for you, the listener, to consider. How do all those layers of personal history, the financial issues, the complex family dynamics that get exposed under the incredibly intense spotlight of a public trial, how do they actually intersect with the very formal, very public pursuit of justice?
And maybe consider this as you go about your day. Think about just how rapidly events escalated here. From what seemed like a normal family lunch to a triple murder investigation that became a global headline. What might that sheer speed of escalation, combined with the glare of intense public scrutiny, actually do to a person who finds themselves under suspicion, regardless of their ultimate guilt or innocence?
It really makes you ponder the sheer weight of those circumstances on an individual, doesn't it?
It does. It's a stark reminder of how quickly life can fundamentally change, and the profound rippling impact of unforeseen and truly devastating events.